New term in Westminster, and it's already started badly. Cooper is trying to get on top of the boats. Rayner is apparently avoiding taxes. And the Prime Minister has stabbed his own Chancellor in the back by stealing her right-hand man.
Do the latest antics in Westminster suggest that the Prime Minister once again has a woman problem?
Vaping on the breach at Brighton, I don't judge her for. It's pretending, I've got to be very careful what I say, declaring that you live there as your primary residence when you're an MP representing somewhere hundreds of miles away.
Tim, it's the first day back of the Westminster school term, 2025 to 26.
And it's raining.
You're looking dapper, by the way.
Yes.
You're in your own journalistic uniform there.
That's very kind of you. It is the second jacket of the day because I got caught in a downpour this morning when I left the house, and I had to actually turn around and go back and
Did
change.
you look like Rishi Sunak announcing the election last year? We still need to find out what happened to that suit.
Let's call it a reset.
You've had a
what
reset.
I did, it wasn't a disaster, it was a reset.
And that's what the Prime Minister has done.
Speaking of which.
Yes. Is it a reset, though? I feel like he's unplugged the telly and then plugged it back in, and actually the picture's still the same, right?
Yes. Well, okay, the context of all of this is we are looking ahead to a budget that's probably going to be even worse than the last one. So it's all about setting us up for that.
Good.
But what has he actually done in this mini-reshuffle, which some backbenchers were expecting to be a proper reshuffle and are a bit disappointed about? Instead, it's very much an insider staffing one. The key thing is that Darren Jones, the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, has been moved to a new role as Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, focused on the delivery of the government's policy agenda, which will require an awkward conversation because he's now going to have to sit down with Starmer and say, what is the policy agenda? Those who are asking, so who was the previous Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, may well do so because it has never existed before.
Oh, it's a made-up role.
It's a new role.
It's a delivery role.
It's
Minister for Delivery.
Yeah.
Not to be confused with the person that deals with the post office at whatever department that is. What's interesting about this is that Rachel Reeves is briefing that she was fully behind this move.
Of course she was, yes.
But I think we can safely conclude that having her deputy, and actually the only sort of competent voice in the Treasury, be taken from her at number 11 and installed at number 10 is a slight.
Yes.
It comes after Crygate.
Yes.
She's been in tears in the Commons. We know there are internal rows going on, rumours of rows with the Prime Minister, rumours of rows with Angela Rayner, the deputy, who, by the way, we'll get on to Three Homes Rayner a little later in this. And now it's almost like she's had a limb cut off. Mm-hmm. The person who has been promoted to become the new Darren Jones, and that's a man called James Murray. Mm-hmm. Now, I feel cruel, but don't get me wrong, because I actually really quite like this man on a personal level. He's a very sweet man.
Yes.
He isn't the strongest media performer. I have found myself sort of carving him up a bit on my GB News show. I think at one point, Spad almost brought a stretcher into the studio to carry him away as I was asking him about tax and spend. This is just a tax and spend government. And he couldn't. This isn't the strongest appointment they could make. And I mean no disrespect. But we've got this narrative around the current cabinet not quite being up to scratch. Mm-hmm. And I think if you were going to send a message that you were really supporting Rachel Reeves, you'd put an old-timer in there, or maybe you'd move Pat McFadden in. You would bolster the operation.
Yes.
I think installing him and then the relatively unknown Dan Tomlinson, who did once do this Daily Tea, but I'm not sure he'd be recognised in his own constituency, says to me, we're hanging the Chancellor out to dry. You know, they've left her there, metaphorically speaking, with a sort of, revolver and a glass of whiskey in her office, plotting her own downward spiral, I would suggest.
Well, and I learned I just did BBC Politics Live, which is where I also learnt that this is the first Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister in history. I also learnt that James Murray is a protégé of Emily Thornberry.
Right.
Yes, and she's very proud of him, and rightly so. Of course, she would like to be in government too. Instead, she's heading the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I think she's actually doing quite a good job of it.
Do you know how she came unstuck?
How did she come unstuck?
She came unstuck when she acknowledged to me that the assault on private school fees and the VAT on private school fees could mean that state class sizes go up.
Right.
And to her credit, Thornberry was the only minister at the time in opposition, shadow minister in opposition, to admit that the exodus would cause problems. Mm-hmm. And as soon as she made that admission, She was culled.
I think it's indicative of the poor way Starmer runs things that she's not in the government. I actually think she's a very competent person when she's on air, and I think it says something that she's not in the government. I think that's a very silly decision. But you're right. Poaching Jones from Treasury to number 10 looks bad for Reeves. But also, let's ask, what does it say about the Prime Minister that he needs to create this special role for delivery? He has been through, I believe, in the last 5 years, 4 different communications directors.
Yes.
So he needs someone to come in to do delivery. He needs a new person to come in to do communications. I infer from that the Prime Minister has not been doing very well on either. And the man, let's be honest, when it comes to communications, he couldn't communicate a letter into a post box, right?
Well,
there is something, the idea that it's the fault of an underling that this
No.
Prime Minister has been failing to connect with the public
Yes.
is absurd.
So they're bringing in former Blairite, a spin doctor called Tim Allen, to try and shake things up on the comms front.
Yeah.
I agree that it's problematic that, unfortunately, the Prime Minister does lack charisma. And also, having just come from yet another Reform press conference where not Nigel Farage, but in this case, his deputy, Richard Tice, has taken a whole list of journalists and, mainstream broadcasters and newspapers and then blogs, people like Unheard got a question, Politico, we got a question, which we'll listen to in a bit. Everybody who was on the list asked a question and it was fielded by Tice perfectly comfortably. Compared to how the Prime Minister reacts to any press scrutiny at all, he is going to absolutely have to up his game, because you've got Farage channeling his inner Trump and Starmer basically invisible for the whole of the summer, really. I mean, I wrote this in my column last week. What have you been doing for the summer apart from firing your third aide? We've got him now. So he's got rid of Sue Gray. As you say, Matthew Doyle, who is head of comms, Nin Pandit, that's the last one he's fired, all gone from Downing Street.
I can tell you a funny story about that, which which, when it came to Nin Pandit, as far as I'm aware, most of Fleet Street was trying to find a photo. And we didn't know who this person was, if they were male or female.
Yes.
There didn't appear to be a photo even
Who
in
is
existence.
Nin Pandit?
And it made me think of that moment in Arrested Development where there's a character who's infamously bland, and they show briefly an excerpt from the high school yearbook that has a photo of her, and beneath it says "not pictured." And that to me is Nin Pandit. But they have been doing things over the summer, which is floating ideas that they then drop. This comes on the back of 2 huge U-turns before the summer: welfare reform of PIPs and winter fuel. So they're running out of money. So what we've had over the summer, we've had various ideas floated. They were looking at reform to certificates for SEND kids. They have floated the idea they may tax sale of properties. They're basically inviting people to send in their ideas
Yes.
of ways
What else could we tax?
to raise money.
Thin air.
Precisely. And so all this is gearing up to, they're going to have a second really, really bad budget. And I think that's the thing that this is all really about.
Yes.
This is about both creating distance from the Treasury so that the Prime Minister's office is better strengthened, so that they're ready to hang her out to dry, while also preparing a communication strategy for what is going to be a really ugly winter. I think we were waiting before the summer for this to be a summer of discontent. And actually, it wasn't. I know there were flags. I know there was whopping. But there were no riots. And things have just kind of bubbled along during the summer. I think actually winter with the budget, I think that's going to be the thing which could really kick things off in Westminster.
And we've got serious rhetoric around a possible IMF bailout. We've got reports that actually the Chancellor's shortfall is now 41 billion. A think tank has come up with that figure, saying that government spending has hit a record high. It's the highest level that it has been in, I think, since 1993. That then goes against all of her claims to maintain fiscal discipline. She hasn't seemed to be a credible figure, I'm sorry, since the tears in the Commons.
No, and now she's about 20% less credible because she's just had Darren Jones taken off her.
And I think the Prime Minister is hoping that somebody, probably her sister Ellie Reeves, will tap her on the shoulder and say, I think you need to go.
Yeah.
You cannot possibly fire her because then he's almost firing himself. This is what happened to Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. We can make that comparison, by the way, because of this whole guilt yields thing that, let's be honest, you and I don't quite understand, but they're
No
high.
idea.
They're
No.
higher than they were under Truss.
High
and
is bad.
She broke the bank.
Right.
Therefore, high is bad, and therefore, if there is some kind of market rebellion against anything that Rachel Reeves announces, we could be in another market turmoil situation that puts so much pressure on the Chancellor. She has nowhere else to go but walk. And then in a way, it solves a problem for Keir Starmer, but it creates another one because she's been the resident sort of SHIT sponge for him, hasn't she? At all turns, he can blame Rachel. Well,
Yes.
it's the Treasury.
Yes.
And what's interesting is he has now got this triumvirate of women, Yvette Cooper, Angela Rayner, and indeed Rachel Reeves, who are all struggling in
Any
their role.
one of them could go.
Well, but then is the threat from Angela Rayner greater or lesser than it was in light of the three-home scandal?
I think it's quite a bit less.
You know, the Labour attitude is it is not a
Yeah.
story. Of course it's a story. We're still reporting on it. The
Yes.
readers are incensed.
It's totally a story. It's like the story to me. She is the Great Gatsby of her generation.
Yes.
She's the Enron of her generation. I think it's a story which says so much about the Labour Party and the governing class in Britain. That they have raised taxes. They are talking about raising taxes further. They have, in the last 15 years, really hit against tax avoidance, often equating it with evasion, making it seem evil. And we have former tweets with Angela that say things like, tax avoidance costs lives, attacking Jeremy Hunt for the various things that he allegedly did. And then it turns out that if given a chance, Labour ministers will find a way to avoid paying tax too.
Yes.
And that is plainly what she has done.
Do as I say, not as I do. It's on a par,
Yes.
isn't it, with two Jags Prescott,
Yes.
Diane Abbott privately educating her son.
Yes.
It speaks to double standards.
Yeah.
Legally, she hasn't apparently done anything wrong. We had Bridget Phillipson, the Education
Yes.
Secretary, being very sisterly and saying she can spend her money how she
yeah.
likes, speaking like a true capitalist.
When middle-class people avoid tax in some way,
They're scumbags.
like buying an ISA or handing their house to their kids before they die,
Or offshoring.
they've done nothing wrong either. But the left gives the impression that they're committing some great immoral sin. So then when she does exactly the same thing, to be clear about what she is accused of doing, that she saved £40,000 in stamp duty on a new flat in Hove after telling tax authorities that that was her main home. But she also told Tameside Council in Manchester that her constituency house in Ashton-under-Lyne remains her primary residence, and informed Brighton and Hove Council that her apartment there was a second home for council tax purposes. And we should add that she, of course, also enjoys a Grace and Favour flat in Admiralty House in central London. So,
And we've reported today that she is registered to vote in both the Manchester property and the Hove property.
Right.
Which doesn't seem
Right.
quite right to me.
Right. So
we
you
need a
represent-
clarification. Which is your main
But
residence?
You represent Ashton, you work in London, but your main residence is a seaside town on the south coast.
And to make matters worse, of course, we should also mention the photograph.
Yes.
Taken presumably very nearby her new £800,000
I don't judge her for
seaside property.
vaping
Look,
on the beach. Yeah.
it's not the best look. Look, I did my
yeah.
column. It's Ed Miliband and his bacon sandwich.
That was the
it's
day-
Prescott throwing
yeah.
the punch.
No, I tweeted
It's-
that day that she was the Prime Minister of People's Hearts. I think vaping on the beach at Brighton, I don't judge her for. It's pretending, I've got to be very careful what I say, declaring that you live there as your
Yes.
primary residence
but I'm just
when
talking
you're an
about the look of
MP
it.
representing somewhere hundreds of miles away.
And I think there is a debate now raging about people commenting on her appearance in the dinghy and whether it's body shaming, although we used to have a huge amount of rhetoric around Jeremy Corbyn wearing anoraks to the cenotaph and all the rest of it, and apparently that was acceptable, but this isn't because she's a woman, but then she's a woman in her own private time. Should she be papped at all when she's out on the beach trying to have fun? So it is a bit of a difficult one. Do you remain an old Labour darling if you've got three homes?
Oh, absolutely you do. And I think in the past you especially could, when people saw you as a working class hero who had done good.
Like Bob Crow,
Right,
who
right.
famously had a quite expensive apartment somewhere in central London and he bought it off the council.
The thing is, I think Labour ideologically and in class terms has changed. It isn't the party of the aspirational working class anymore. It's really the party of the pink-haired eco-loon. And I don't think those people would see it as aspirational. I don't think they would say, good for you, Ange. I think they probably would say she's a hypocrite because they're totally ideologically sold on everyone must give every penny in their income to the government.
Well, and also they'll be increasingly likely to either vote for Corbyn or indeed the Greens, who are relaunching on Tuesday, I believe. Something we may or may not cover.
But to go back to this point, the sackings, which will continue until morale improves, the sackings have thus far been internal. The question is, at what point do the sackings become external? And you are right to name those three: Cooper, Rayner, Reeves. I don't think Rayner would go. If nothing else, Holmes feels like one of the few things Labour's doing something on. So Reeves versus Cooper, who's going to go? OK,
so can Cooper deliver on this pledge? So today she's going to tell the Commons that she wants to crack down on the number of dependents an asylum seeker who has been granted asylum can bring to the UK. The figures on this are quite eye-watering. They've risen, the number of refugees' family members who are granted visas to come to Britain, from 4,300 in 2023 to 20,600 in the year to this March.
Yes.
And we have reported on cases where refugees to this country have literally brought dozens of relatives over.
Yeah.
And I actually put this to Richard Tice today. Reform had a press conference, which we'll get onto, about pensions. It was a bit dry, but I thought let's ask him what Reform would do about refugees and their dependents. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is today going to announce a crackdown on the number of dependents asylum seekers who have been granted asylum can bring to the UK. Those numbers have increased from 4,300 in 2023 to 20,600 in the year to this March. If you've been granted asylum to live in the UK, how many dependents does Reform think people should be able to bring over?
Yeah, really good question. We know that this system, and we've heard of some families who are bringing over double figures, even more than 20. This is outrageous. This is an abuse of our generosity. We need to completely relook at it. Have I got a specific answer for you here and today? No. We need to dig into what actually has really gone on, look at all the data and come to a view as to what is appropriate and fair. If I take us back to credit where credit's due, back in the early 2000s, we were accepting about 20,000 asylum seekers every year. And it was about 20% of those who applied. So we can look back at what level of dependencies came across then. It sort of worked then. Some people say it's a bit much, a bit too. If it worked then, sometimes if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The system currently is broke. It does need fixing, but we should learn lessons from where things worked decades ago. So have I got a specific number? No. Will we dig into the detail and come up with a sensible number? Yes, absolutely.
And today, Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, has told the Commons that Labour plans a crackdown on the number of dependents refugees who are granted asylum to live in the UK can bring over from their home countries.
So in our asylum policy statement later this year, we will set out a new system for family migration, including looking at contribution requirements, longer periods before newly granted refugees can apply, and dedicated controlled arrangements for unaccompanied children and for those fleeing persecution who have family in the UK. And we aim to have some of those changes in place for the spring. But in the meantime, we do need to address the immediate pressures on local authorities and the risks from criminal gangs using family reunion as a pull factor to encourage more people onto dangerous boats. Therefore, we are bringing forward new immigration rules this week to temporarily suspend new applications under the existing dedicated refugee family reunion route. Until the new framework is introduced, refugees will be covered by the same family migration rules and conditions as everyone else.
This continues to morph into the most right-wing government of my lifetime. And this is a classic example of where one mistake then leads to policies to correct that, which may be an overcorrection. So the mistake is allowing people to bring such a large number of dependents to the country. But what the government is applying at the same time is saying that the dependents who come over must also have good English language skills and also relative income, which is not unlike legal migration, right? If you want to legally migrate to this country, you have to prove how much income you've got so you won't be dependent upon the state. And I just think if you think about that in principle, if someone is fleeing from Iran, right, and they come to this country and they've been approved, it's been proven they are under threat of death, so they're allowed to stay in the country, they of course want a child or a wife to join them in this country. And I think the idea of saying to them, but can they speak English and how much money do they make, to me it just is an inversion of the principle of asylum. So are they supposed to wait in Iran themselves, potentially under the threat of death, until they've completed an English language course?
But then maybe you're just saying then you can bring a spouse and your children, but that's it, not granny, grandpa,
that's fine.
aunt and uncle.
And this is my point.
But I don't understand why Tice can't give that answer. This is the trouble with reform. You sort of try and drill into the detail, and then they're like, oh, well, we haven't, it's too soon to say.
Yes. They're not making commitments. They're not making commitments in part because they don't want to get caught out, but also because they think they're going to enter government at some point and they don't want to have overextended themselves.
Cooper, of course, is having to channel her own inner Nigel Farage because, let's be honest...
It's a very unconvincing drag act.
It is, isn't it? This is a woman who had a right go at Liam Byrne, her own Labour colleague, when he invented the term hostile environment for illegal immigrants. Illegal, because it's always been blamed on the Tories. This was Liam Byrne's invention as immigration minister back in the Blair-Brown years. He said, we must create a hostile environment for illegal immigrants. And a load of lefties, do you remember this? We forget these things happen. A load of lefties went, this is completely unacceptable. And he was saying, but no, I'm talking about people who are coming in here criminally.
Yes.
Anyway, I digress.
And also Darren Jones, who we were discussing earlier, got in trouble on Question Time for talking about children and women on the boats, when in fact that's a very small number.
The vast majority are women and children.
Precisely,
But I think Cooper is now going to struggle to recover from this decision in court last week, this admission from the Home Office that actually we believe that the rights of asylum seekers trump those of the people of Epping. The tax-paying public of Epping are further down the chain. And we've had loads of responses to that, haven't we, on the Telegraph website, to our own writing, online and all the rest of it. I almost think that's kind of like quite the kind of moment, the watershed moment for this Labour government, because it absolutely plays into Farage and the reform narrative that this Labour government cares more about people coming here illegally than it does people who pay their way. And it's not even about British-born, by the way. I don't think people are saying that either. They're perfectly happy to have people come here from other countries legally, to integrate, to work, to pay tax. They just cannot get their head around this idea that the Home Office is basically saying that it will prioritise people who arrive here by boat over those who have done all the right things throughout their life to try and make a contribution to this country.
I think the paradox is that the left would say the government's actually moved really right-wing on asylum. I mean, for instance, another part of her package is to tweak the law so that the ECHR cannot be used to prevent deportations. That's interesting. If that could be done, then do we need to leave the ECHR? That might have consequences for Kemi Badenoch and her famous review, which we're all desperately waiting to hear from. But every time the government does something right-wing, in inverted commas, on asylum, it's usually because the public has forced it to. It's usually 2 or 3 steps behind where the public are. And then so, for instance, the government actually plans to end the use of hotels. We should say the government does not want people in hotels. It's planning to get them out by processing them faster and deporting them. That's probably a good idea. But in the meantime, what's it going to do with them while they're in the hotels? Because if it kicked them out, they would go into private accommodation and then people will be competing with them for homes. So this is the problem the government's in. It's come to the argument late and it probably doesn't believe in it in principle. So it's not convincing people that it's taking the steps that need to be taken.
But don't worry, because they now have a minister for delivery. So Darren Jones, you can deal with all of this stuff.